Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's your favorite truck driver in the whole wide world, trucking down the highway, going down Highway 75 in Florida. I'm looking at the highway, so I'm not really looking at the screen, and I'm basically going to treat this like a phone call. And this is Wise Guys, episode number 1875. Not really, but I think it's episode number 9. And it's actually Bitcoin Ben and
Gammon.
Gammon, yeah. Everyone, I hope you know who I am. Bitcoin Ben. Check me out on YouTube at Bitcoin Ben on YouTube, and check out my website at www.bitcoinben.io. Would you like to introduce yourself and where everyone can actually find you?
Sure. My name is George Gammon. I've got a YouTube channel. That's where most people most know me from. And it's just my name, George, typical spelling, Gammon, Gammon. And I just do a lot of whiteboard videos where I discuss macroeconomics, pretty much from an Austrian free market libertarian standpoint.
Awesome. Thanks, George. We're basically just going to talk about probably very economic, because that's what him and I are actually both involved in. I'm more the cryptocurrency side. He's actually more of the traditional, global economic, everything economic. George is your guy. I'm more of a crypto guy. Although I know like what's going on generally in the global economic world, George has more history of actually dealing in that world. So his level of knowledge is higher than mine. And so what I'd like to ask your opinion on is what happened over in Russia, and economically, what do you see this leading to when all of the government under President Putin basically resigned and turned in their walking papers once they said he had a plan to basically remove their power anyway, and so they would just rather resign and walk away now.
Right. Well, boy, I could go so many different directions there. First of all, I'd want to make sure that I recognize the source, because I can tell you, as someone who's lived in the United States and outside of the United States, the U.S. media tends to have an American-centric spin on things, to say the very, very least. It's
very least, yeah.
It's really quite incredible. But assuming that's true, I think listen, I listened to Thursday night's episode of Macro Voices. For those of you who are interested in macroeconomics, I'd highly suggest the podcast. But they had a gentleman on by the name of Grant Williams, who is the co-founder of Real Vision TV. And he was talking about all of the social unrest that's going around, or that's going on around the world. And he rattled off just several different countries. It's not just Chile, Venezuela, France. There's a lot of different countries. And the theme is very consistent. Whether they're underling politicians or people in the general public, the majority of just people are pissed off and they don't like what's going on. There's a very small handful of people who have benefited from overreaching governments, and you can just pick them. They're all overreaching. It's just to what degree. And quantitative easing, central banks just taking interest rates negative, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Fed, they're all the same to a certain degree. And these people are angry. And you don't have to look for these big black swan type events to get some serious unrest. And that's to put it mildly, because there's so much pent up frustration from the bottom up. And using Chile as an example, that whole uprising was or not the whole thing, but the pin that broke the camel's back on that was just a simple, like a 7 cent or 50 cent increase in bus fares. And it was just like after 5. It was like from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. It wasn't even the whole entire day. To get the specifics, make sure you listen to that podcast episode with Grant. But it's so my point is, it's not the fact that they're just raising bus fare by 50 cents. It's that there's all this pent up frustration that's just looking for a release valve. And whether that's in Chile or whether that's with the underlings in the political class in Russia, it's all the same. And in my opinion, it's getting worse. It's not getting better.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. It's the world is like a pool of fuel waiting for that one match.
Yeah, right.
And what will actually be that one little flicker of light that just lights it all on fire. And the source of what I heard with Russia was actually RT. So
okay. I'd trust that.
Yeah, and I heard it from many other sources after it was announced. And basically what I see that as is we kind of got the same thing going on in the US. Right? We have a split right now. We have the nationalist, which is Trump.
Right.
And then we have the globalists that are probably 3/4 of everyone else, Republican and also Democrat. Romney is no different than Pelosi. It's
right.
Globally they agree. They want the authority of legislation on a global layout. They want the authority residing in the UN and not at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Trump is actually pulling that back. Trump is saying, no, we will not actually bend a knee to the UN. And Putin is also a nationalist. He's the Russian equivalent of Trump in the nationalistic ideals way.
Right.
Not with how he runs his country or anything like that, but in the idea of nationalistic sovereignty, where the government that was under Putin was basically filled with progressive globalists, just like under Trump. See,
Right.
if Trump wins this election, you're going to see a mass exodus of retirement. We've already seen quite a few lifelong politicians, or at least senior to mid-level politicians, retire. We had Paul Ryan, who had nothing but a bright political career ahead of him, all of a sudden go, I'm out. And we have others retiring also. Well, when Trump wins this election, you're going to see a mass exodus of retirements, because like over in Russia and over in Ukraine and in other areas of the world, for the last 40 years, they've had nothing but a progressive, global leaning government structure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we've had in America since Reagan. You know, Reagan was the last true nationalistic leaning government or president that we've ever had. Well, they tried shooting him. Luckily, he lived through it. Prior to that was actually Nixon. Well, they got rid of his ass. Prior to that, it was JFK. Well, they got rid of him. Trump, and it's why the progressives are trying to get rid of Trump. They're trying their damnedest to get rid of Trump. And the Republican progressives have the worst job of all, because they have to try and help get rid of Trump without looking like they're trying to help get rid of Trump. They have the hardest, like Romney and all of the progressive Republicans. They can't openly go against Trump because of his popularity. But they don't want him to achieve his goals of bringing the government structure and the economic structure of America back in line with the U.S. Constitution. They can't have that, because the Constitution, the structure laid out in the Constitution, is completely opposite of what the structure the globalists want. And so if Trump wins this election, which I think he will, they're going to have one option left. They're going to have to get rid of Trump. They're going to have to physically get rid of Trump. They'll have to pull a JFK. There's no other way around it, because Trump's not going to give up. Trump's not going to quit. Trump's not going to resign. Trump, even if they impeach him, that doesn't mean he's out of office. It's just, it means he's impeached. That's it. That is a political tool, not a legal tool.
Right. I don't know how much Trump I mean, I don't know. I don't follow politics as much as I follow economics, because to be frank, it makes me sick. So I try to, just for my own sanity, I try to unplug myself as much as I can from, especially American politics. But I just, although I think I see Trump as a bull in a china shop, in the sense that you know, I don't know if he has any core principles, like as an example, like a Ron Paul, but he kind of just does what he wants, and sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. I did a video kind of using a video clip from his most recent press conference with talking about the China trade deal, how they signed phase one. And you can see how he's reading from a script. He's reading his speech that was obviously written for him, where he is thanking all of these individuals. And midway through, he just completely goes off script because something catches his attention, and he starts talking about how he, quote unquote, loves the idea of negative interest rates, and that he thinks the dollar is just way too strong, and that we're having to compete with all these other countries. So you're right. I see how he is kind of bringing the narrative back from this centralized world power to something that's more focused on a local level, even if it's at a federal government, being the United States. But he he just does it in a way that while he's doing it, he's also doing things that are just incredibly dangerous. But more so, back to the Constitution, um, I I hate to be a pessimist, but and I wish more than anything that the United States would start to go back in that direction of small government, and really based on what the Constitution was all about. I mean, if you could just imagine it, if the forefathers were alive today and they saw the size and the power and the scope of the federal government, I mean, they would be appalled. They would not even recognize the country. That we have gone so far astray from the intentions of the Constitution and those who wrote it originally, that going back that direction, I just don't see that happening. Now I hope I'm wrong. I absolutely hope I'm wrong. But let me also throw another curveball at you, because I think the premise of what you're talking about is the difference between uh, more centralized power and a decentralization of power. And I did another video last week where I highlighted a guy by the name of Richard Werner, who is a UK a professor, economist, and he's an expert in international banking. And he had a few blog posts where he was referencing his opinion that the ECB in particular, but you can just insert any central bank, is trying to um, consolidate power within the banking system by forcing the smaller banks to go out of business. So let's take a step back. Why would that be? Well, the smaller banks are the ones that lend typically to small business, mid-sized business. You're not going to have J.P. Morgan lend money to your local Subway franchisee, because the deal is just too small. So that would be a small community bank, or something at a local level. So Warner's hypothesis is that, number one, they want to ban cash so they can take interest rates negative. And then he thinks that they want to take interest rates negative because, as you know, retail banks, not the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgans of the world, but the small retail banks that are on your corner, those guys make money by just borrowing short and lending long, just typical your normal banking business model. Where these other guys, of course, make money with all these other financial shenanigans. But because they do that, if they have a flat yield curve, meaning that the interest rates on the short end of the yield curve are similar to the interest rates on the long end, or if it's inverted, it's even worse, which a lot of times happens when interest rates go negative, or they try to take them negative. Um, then what happens is you're putting out all of the business, or excuse me, all the banks that make money borrowing short and lending long. In other words, typical banking, you're putting them out of business. They cannot make money in that environment. There's absolutely no way. So then the only people that are, or the only entities that are left standing, according to Werner's hypothesis, are the big banks. Let's just say JP Morgan, here, Citibank, those types of entities. Then he takes it a step further and says, okay, so once the central banks have consolidated power within these very few large institutions that they kind of control, that are under their umbrella, then what happens if we go through the next financial crisis where these banks that are just completely over leveraged and are taking all of this risk with derivatives, the repo market, the foreign FX market? What happens when they have their Lehman moment, and which Werner thinks is going to happen, and might even be orchestrated by the central bank, that they're trying to blow this bubble up even greater than it would be, because they know that consumes all of these big banks that are within their umbrella. And then once the bubble pops, then all these big banks that now have all the power go to the Fed or the central bank and say, hey, we need a bailout. We're bust. We're screwed. We're done. And then the central banks look at them and say, no, not going to happen again. Then the only banks that you're left with in the entire world, while you have a cashless society, so you have a digital government-backed society in every major developed country in the world, and the only bank that would control not only the money but the credit would be the central banks. And if they control the money, if they control the credit, they control everything.
Right. And let me add on to that. That links with the Agenda 21 project. The Agenda 21 project is the global taxation plan that links with that. Because what they need to do is remove the nationalistic taxation structure of each country and roll it into the global taxation structure of the carbon credit tax.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the taxation mechanism that will actually fund the global government structure that runs the global banking structure that you just talked about. Because what they're doing is they're trying to achieve what Trump is trying to achieve in America, except on a global scale.
Right.
And the taxation structure will be different at a global level, where Trump, and this is another way of looking at it that proves he's moving it back towards the Constitution. When Trump was elected, one of the first things he did was institute programs that created tariffs on China. And what he explained was, we've been getting screwed with our GDP and our global trade imbalance for so many years. Well, yeah, because they were globalizing the manufacturing uh, section of the whole world. So they they were actually taking the corporations of America and they were globalizing the the labor force of these mega corporations. And Trump reversed or is in the process of reversing the taxation structure back into what it originally was when the Constitution was implemented. The, the government of America was originally structured to be financed using tariffs. That was the only funding mechanism for the uh, the national government, the U.S. government, the federal government, was actually tariffs. Trump has put that back in play. And the reason he's saying that he loves negative interest rates links with the structure of the nationalizing the banks. Originally, the American currency had no interest attached to it. There was no reason to tax the citizens of America because the tariffs handled the funding of the government through tariffs. And the National U.S. Bank that was operating at the time, the loan or the issuance of the currency from the Treasury of the United States government had no interest on it. And that's what Trump's trying to get back to, is that taxation structure. Now, once, and this is why the Federal Reserve is actually trying to not lower interest rates, because they know if they lower the interest rates and everyone thinks that the Federal Reserve not wanting to lower interest rates is because they don't want the economy to overheat and blow a bubble. That's not it at all. They know that if the Federal Reserve goes to 0% interest rates, that it can easily be nationalized, because the American government will basically be borrowing money or printing money at no cost to the federal government. That's basically issuing a currency from the Treasury with zero interest attached. That's what Trump's talking about, is reaching a point where the federal, the Federal Reserve is basically nationalized in an interest rate kind of way, where Trump can borrow as much money from the Federal Reserve as he wants and not have to pay any interest. The national debt will quit going up. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about MMT basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you just have to ask yourself what the unintended consequences could possibly be of a government having 100% control over the money supply. And
Well,
I get this from people on both sides of the coin who have their political views, but I think a lot of times we forget that even if our guy is in the office right now, that 4 years from now, then the next guy is going to be there. And like Milton Friedman, I think, hit on this the best. And I don't remember his exact quote, but he was talking about the federal government having power. And in certain situations, you could say, okay, it's good that the government has this power, but that's assuming that there's someone that's in the office right now and for the indefinite future that's completely benevolent. So you can imagine, as an example, if Donald Trump was able to achieve this, to that where the government could or Trump himself, the president, could literally just create as much money or currency units. Let's be honest, it's not money,
yeah,
currency units as he wanted to pay for literally anything. And then Trump leaves office, and let's say AOC gets in there. Okay, fantastic. Now what are you going to start printing $20 trillion a year so we can, have a rail system that goes to Australia, or we're going to ban gas vehicles, or and I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that now you've got someone in power that's got control over the purse strings that could just completely go wild, not know what they're doing, and be even more of an economic bull in a china shop than Trump, and just create complete disaster. Look at what happened in Venezuela. I mean, most Americans don't realize that, well, I mean, what, 10, 15 years ago, Venezuela had one of the best economies in all of South America. I mean, people were praising it for how great it was and how many people were being lifted out of poverty. And it was just this model country that we should all look to as an example. Even a lot of the economists, I don't know if Krugman ever said this. I wouldn't doubt it if he did, though. We're throwing praise at Venezuela and what they had done. Well, sure enough, that was a perfect example of a bull being in an economic china shop, that they didn't realize what they were doing. They didn't have a good enough grasp on how the world works. And then they started basically mortgaging all of their oil to China or other countries. And then when oil drops, then it hits the fan. And the only thing that they can do to pay the bills, because they've nationalized all the oil companies, and that's basically their entire economy, is just print money, and then you get hyperinflation. So my point is that with any type of with the government having that type of control, that's going to lead most likely in the long term to some really, really bad outcomes. And also too, although if and I'm going to preface with a big if Trump's motivations are as commendable as you're saying, then it's still, you got to ask yourself, okay, that genie is so far out of the bottle when you're talking about how the structure of the U.S. economy works right now, that if you tried to put it back in the bottle, meaning go more to a business model of what the United States was built on when they created the Constitution, I don't know that wouldn't make it worse. Because, like, let me give you an example. Right now, we have wages that economists would call sticky, in the sense that, let's say you've got a $10 minimum wage. Well, you can't drop wages any lower than that. So if we were to go into a round of healthy deflation, and most people, they hear that word and they've been preconditioned by the government to think that that's bad and we're all doomed, when you don't realize that back in the late 1800s, the United States went through one of its biggest growth spurts economically, and we were in a period of real GDP. We were of deflation, rather, prices
yeah.
going down in real terms. So if we have that deflationary cycle, or if we had an economy like that, even if it was extremely healthy, like it was back in the late 1800s, That would not work now, because back then wages could move up and down with prices. So if the prices of goods and services go down by 50%, well, fine, my wages go down by 40% and I'm still ahead. But now you've got an economy where wages can't go down. So if you did have that deflation, then that would really create huge problems. So then taking it a step further, you talk about the globalization of the manufacturing base of the United States, which is absolutely true. But now you've got to ask yourself, you go down the aisle at Target or Walmart, and okay, so how many of those goods or that you're looking at are made in the United States? Very few. And then you've got to ask yourself, every single time you look at a vacuum cleaner, you look at an oven, you look at whatever it is, as far as a consumer good, how long would it take the United States to build the infrastructure and the manufacturing needed to create that widget? Well, that's a long time. And then you've got to assume that there would be investors that would be willing to finance that without the government having to print money, which would just create inflation. And then you look at the savings rate of the United States, and it's what, 3-4%. I mean, the U.S. the average consumer has $400 or $500 in the bank, so they're not going to be financing these. And you have to say, okay, well, what about foreign direct investment? Okay, well, if the Federal Reserve or if Donald Trump has his way and we take interest rates negative, you're not going to have a lot of capital that's wanting to invest in the United States if they're, especially another thing, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but if the government were to take control over the printing of the United States dollar, and I'm not saying that they're not in control of the Fed, I obviously think they're in cahoots, but if they had 100% control, so Trump could just wake up one morning and say, you know what, I want to spend $1 trillion on this. Boom, done. The Fed prints it, and there you go. If they had that, you've got to think of what would happen to the dollar. So we because the dollar is the world reserve currency, we've got trillions and trillions, potentially more dollars outside of the United States than we actually have circulating within the United States. So if you're someone that just, let's say you're someone in Russia or Japan, and you have 20 million US dollars in your bank account, and you see that Trump all of a sudden, or AOC, has control over printing dollars. How fast do you want to get rid of those dollars? Pretty damn fast. So how do you get rid of those? Either you sell them into the FX market, or you go back into the United States and you inject it into the US domestic economy by buying whatever, real estate or something. Okay, well, that gets the money circulating within the United States. That increases velocity. And then you have this just downward spiral of the dollar to where it's just, I mean, you could mathematically, you could have a Venezuela type situation. I know that the probability is very low, but if you look at the actual math, it is realistic. So then going back to this manufacturing base, so you've got, how are they going to build these factories? How are they going to build the shops? And where are they going to get the workers to work at a low enough wage to create consumer goods that Americans can actually afford to buy? The answer is they can't. So then what would happen is the only goods and services that we would have available to us would be services and goods that are made in the United States. Okay, well, that's going to really shrink your options. And not only is it going to shrink your options, but the cost of those options are going to go through the roof. So you've got the cost of these going up through the roof. You've got the dollar collapsing in that type of environment. And you take the United States going from, the standard of living being extremely high to the standard of living being that of almost a third world country. And I don't want to get too alarmist. I'm not going to say third world country, but it would look very much like Argentina looks right now, where people aren't living in caves and eating canned goods, but it's not good, and the standard of living is decreasing rapidly.
Yes, I agree with most of what you said. Uh, where I disagree is the idea that there's not going to be a natural balance of the value of the dollar once the actual dollar is nationalized uh, in a way with 0% interest. Because what Trump, we have two choices. We either keep the progressive global structure and keep the US dollar as the world's number one trade currency, the reserve currency, or we nationalize like Trump is going to do, and America will have choices. We will have choices, but if we keep the U.S. dollar as the global reserve, the global banking structure will never go away. It will absolutely never go away. Where if we nationalize the currency, like Trump, I think, is going to do, America will, it's not going to be easy, but it's going to bring us back to a place where America has sovereignty over the decisions in America, where basically we live or we die at the education or the ignorance of the American people.
Yeah, that
Where,
I mean, that may be true, but the standard of living would be cut in half at
yeah,
best.
that's going to happen no matter what. It's just, will we have the control to reverse it once it happens? That Clinton's job, if she was to be elected, was to bring in that collapse through war, like they've done in every other time they've changed the global economic control structure. They had a war that led to the switch.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened in World War One. That's what happened in World War Two. It's always war that rearranges the map, and then after the war, they put in the global banking structure aligned with the map that the war brought in. And so Trump, using 0% interest, is going to bring that collapse to happen again. That collapse is unavoidable. We cannot avoid the collapse that's in progress right now. We see it in the overnight repo rates. We're collapsing. We're in a free fall. We're gonna hit the ground, and we're either gonna go pure globalist or we're gonna go nationalist. There's gonna be no middle of the road. We're gonna have to make a choice. This election is, we go nationalist with Trump or we go globalist with any other choice. And what Trump is working on doing right now is he's using a global economic trade war instead of a physical war to realign or to bring upon the world political wars instead of physical wars. Right now, the war over in Europe is the Brexit war. It's the war against their globalist elite against their nationalist elite. Trump and the other nationalists are trying to keep it at a at a at a at a war of the politicians. The global progressives are trying to lead us into a physical war. That's what's going on in Iran right now. Is the globalists want Trump to react and just send in troops and let's bomb the crap out of Iran. They need the distraction of the physical war so that the underlying economic structure that will be put in after the war has something to point to.
Yeah. So I think one thing I'd add is because again I don't really follow the political side of it too much, but it is interesting that you bring up this global tax, and I haven't looked into the Agenda 21, although I've heard about it several times. But when you're saying that, I was just kind of thinking that it's, and I haven't really researched this, or I haven't really thought it through too much, but it is interesting that the MMT crowd, especially, and I'm not sure how most Keynesians feel about this, but the MMT folks especially believe that the value of the currency is derived from taxation. So if you have, the only thing that gives the US dollar value is that the government requires you to pay it in taxes. So so they think that's a prerequisite for a currency, right? So
Yep.
if you take what you were saying earlier about this global taxation and you kind of start connecting the dots, you see that, and I'm not saying this is the way it is, but I'm just saying this
You're
is kind of
absolutely right.
where my mind is going. Yeah, is that if they wanted if they believed that that was true, that taxation is what gave the currency power, let's say, and they wanted a global currency, well, then they would need global taxation to back up that currency or to give it power. And we've all heard about the SDRs.
And hey,
Rickard's talked about it all the time.
hang on 1 second. And how would you quote unquote, fairly tax each nation? You would actually tax it off of the GDP, the production capabilities of that country, right? It's how wealthy is that country? Well, how much does it produce? That's how you would reach that idea of at what level do you tax each country if it's a global tax. You would have to actually tie it to the one element that all countries' production is tied to, which is carbon dioxide, which is the exhaust, the the production remnants, the remnants of producing goods. It it's it's why they actually talk about, and excuse the bluntness, the cow farts. Well, cows are a product. How do you how how do you tax the productivity and the economic energy through a cow? You would tax at one level the food going in, the calorie absorption of the cow would be cut. This is deep microeconomics, right? The the calorie cost per unit of energy that cow uses would have an inlet and an outlet. The inlet would be how much they consume of food. Well, that has a price. Well, how would you calculate the outlet energy that cow used in the growth of the meat of the cow? You would use carbon because the food is made out of carbon. The flatulence level of the cow would give you the idea of the amount of carbon the cow used to grow its meat on its body, and that would give you the plus and minus of the economic cost of that cow's existence.
Right.
You
But
see
how do
what
they
I'm
measure the
saying?
carbon? I do. I know exactly what you're saying. But how do they measure the carbon?
Because the say the cow is actually fed corn. Each grain of corn, according to its weight,
Oh,
is a certain amount of carbon.
Oh, okay.
The
Right, got it.
the flatulence released is the carbon released into the atmosphere.
Right. So you wouldn't measure that. You would just measure basically the input and then take a percentage of it. Yeah, I got it.
Right. See, people laugh at the people on the left whenever they talk about that. Whenever they say, well, we have to tax the cow farts. People laugh at it because it sounds funny. But there is a calculation of energy cost in that environment of consumption of the corn, the production of the meat of the cow's growth, and the exhaust of that cost of production.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they're talking. They're not actually talking about the cow farts. That just makes it sound funny, right? But there is an economic cost in that growth of the meat.
Right. Well, there's something that you can quantify. There's a
Right.
quantifiable number that you could tax based on those equations.
Exactly. You have a formula, a mathematical formula,
right,
that you can apply to it. And that's what Agenda 21 is all about. It's the taxation structure of a global government would have to be based on the productivity of each of the participating nations, because that's how you would measure the taxation obligation of that nation.
right. What according to this Agenda 21, or the people who get into it, what would the tax rates be? Would they be progressive or would they be flat?
They would actually be flat.
So flat
They,
rate, but just based on what your consumption or your carbon consumption or carbon omission was, it would be a 10% of X, or regardless of whether it was Panama or Russia or the United States. It's so
right,
okay. So it's not going up in the sense that like our progressive tax, the more you make, the more percentage of your income that you actually pay.
exactly. How it would be structured would be like this, like uh, uh, each country in the global structure would be allocated carbon credits in alignment with the number of humans in that country. Right. So, and this creates the whole structure that Al Gore looked at the car- carbon futures trading market that Al Gore, with his partner, not joking, this is the guy's last name is Blood. So the company is Gore and Blood.
Nice.
That's the name of the company. All right. They would be trading carbon credits amongst the countries. So Africa, who doesn't produce much, would be allocated their yearly number of credits that they're allowed to produce that much carbon in their country. Well, if they're not producing that much carbon, they could sell the carbon credits to America, and America could produce more carbon.
Yeah,
And
right.
that's the market that's what they want to create. They want to create a global carbon market that would regulate the productivity of each of the nations of the globe. That productivity would be linked with the taxation actually based on the carbon credits system.
Yeah, I mean it, yeah, it's I mean it's just centralizing power, and there's just I don't see any. I'm not going to say that. Let me be completely objective right here. I have seen cases that I need to admit where a centralized power is better than a democracy. And I know that sounds crazy to say that, but let's just use the example of Singapore. So the way, and I'm not sure if it's run this way now, but I've spent a lot of time in Singapore, and for many years, although they had elections and whatnot, it was really run by one guy and his family. And the thing is, if you've got that type of centralized power, it allows the entity or the individual that's in charge to make better long-term decisions because they're not worried about the next election cycle. They don't care because they're there. They're the person calling the shots. So if you get someone that is this benevolent dictator, you can have a situation where it is actually preferred because they can make long-term decisions that will benefit the society at large. We can't make decisions like that in the United States because we are a democracy, and at a certain point it's mob rule. That's the problem with
Well,
democracy. And
hang on a second. Hang on a second. In the original structure of America, the strongest elected officials were the governors of the those were the strongest officials in the original structure of the government. The president barely had any power at all.
Right, and it was a representative republic as well, and that's what the fathers, they were trying to avoid, is the problem with democracy. But let me be clear, I'm not saying that I like centralized power. Quite the opposite. I mean, I'm a libertarian, almost, maybe even I wouldn't go as far as an anarchist, but maybe in certain situations, maybe. But I like decentralized power. I like the states having power. I like the states competing against one another for the business of the population, just like a free market economy. But I just to be fair and to play devil's advocate, I know that there are situations that having that centralized control is beneficial. The problem with that, again, going back to Milton Friedman, is sooner or later, someone is the more power the government has, the more the power thirsty people in society will want to be a part of that government and will get there any way that they can. And so the more you centralize power, the more probability, or the higher probability is that you get someone in control that has an insatiable lust for that power. So if you just had a computer generated model, like a video game where you just had like a joystick that you could control people like a chessboard, then yeah, that might be beneficial. But in the long run, you're going to get a dictator, and it's going to get really ugly really fast. So my point is that it's a lot like capitalism. Capitalism is by far it's far from perfect, but it's just far better than anything else. And I think it's the same thing with with that type of political structure. But my point is that centralized power, regardless of whether the objective or the business model, or it's bad. It's really, really bad. And if you're someone who values personal freedom and liberty over anything else, including safety, then you really need to be concerned with what's going on, regardless of whether it's an Agenda 21 type thing that you're following, or it's a consolidation of power by the central banks, like Professor Richard Werner is following. It all is leading to one destination, and that is more centralized power, which means more government and less personal freedom. And that's what really it really makes me ill, to be quite honest with you.
The original construction of America, according to the Constitution, that's why Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin all agreed that the key to a free society is a well-educated public.
Yeah.
It's because freedom has a cost. The cost is not war. The cost is education. Yeah. And what the part where people say that America's flawed because it's not the best idea, but it's the best one we got. No, it's the only idea. It actually makes the participants of the country live in the reality of their choices. Where if the general public is ignorant, then the government will reflect that ignorance. It's It's why we have to educate the public. And that's actually been going on for a while now. That's why we're moving back more nationalistic and moving. That's why Trump was elected. Trump was elected because there's enough of the older generation that was educated in the original idea of America, and that community has educated either through private school or homeschooling or just actually talking and actually being involved with their children, that their children were and are enough of the populace to elect Trump. And so Trump knows, and I think we all feel this, unless we turn this around with Trump, the education structure of the progressives is already in too strong, that if we don't turn it around with this election, that the next generation will be ignorant of the idea that freedom is in itself an economic system. It's called the free market capitalist system. A large swath of the youth think that you have to have an authoritarian entity to manage an environment. They don't understand that the participants in the environment naturally manage themselves.
Right.
And
you know where you see that. You know where you see that a lot, Ben, is I spend a lot of time out of the United States, as you know, and sometimes, I mean, generally, I'm in big cities, but often I'm on the coast of, let's say, in Ecuador, where you've got a little small fishing village of 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000. I mean, that would be huge. That would be like a booming metropolis. But my point is that, and the government there is so inconsequential because they're so limited on the resources that they have. I mean, in some of those fishing villages, you can go a week and not see a cop. I mean, yes, I mean, you could almost do anything. And as far as any type of government assistance, I mean, you're on your own. You got your fishing boat, you got your net, and you've got the guy at the local store. And it's just a very simple economy. And somehow it magically works. I mean, I don't know how, but without government control, without an authoritarian counterparty there at all times, I get out of my hotel, or I wake up, I leave the hotel room. Somehow the hotel magically has breakfast, fresh fruit. Wow. I go out to the beach, and somehow there are guys out there renting surfboards and renting fishing pools and going on scuba trips and doing all these things. And they don't need a government. Not only that, let's take it a step further. You go into one of these towns, obviously they have cars, trucks, and everything like that. I mean, how many stoplights do you see in these towns? I mean, zero, none. There are none. They can't afford to put any up. So every once in a while, you might see a stop sign if you're lucky. And I'm not saying that we don't need stoplights or anything, but I'm just showing, I'm using that as an example of, if you leave people to their own devices, you would be shocked at how productive they can be just working with one another to achieve a specific objective without the puppeteer manhandling everything from above. And it's shocking, especially now in the United States, how few young people actually realize that they truly believe. And again, the problem, going back to your education thing, is that the government controls education. So how do you work that one out, right? So if you've got this entity that is reliant upon people being ignorant, actually teaching them, how are you ever going to uh, get rid of that ignorance? It's going to be permanent, and if not grow on itself. And I think that the current condition in the United States is a fantastic example of that. You look at you see it in very small
Well,
levels. You know, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
how you get rid of that ignorance is, and I'm going to use my own children as an example. Right, my son and my daughter, I actually kicked out. I I actually kicked them out of my house once they reached a certain age and were showing non-productive movement in their life. So my son was in his room playing video games late at night. I warned him over and over again, look, boy, I love you, but I love you enough to kick you the fuck out.
Right.
Well, it reached a point where I literally at 3 o'clock in the morning, I kicked him out.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, what am I supposed to do? And I go, not my problem, boy. You're a man now. Go make it on your own. The only cure for laziness is hunger.
Yeah.
My grandfather actually taught me that year. He used to tell me that once a week. The only cure for laziness is hunger. And what I did was I actually kicked out my son. That he went over to his mom's house. They argued, they fight, they do all that. But he's now in the military over in Japan, living his life in his reality, and made the choice to join the military of his own free will. He's living in his own reality. That is the only way to bring America back to what it was, is to make people live in their own reality. If you work, you eat. If you do not work, you do not eat. If you do not eat, you will get hungry. When you get hungry enough, you will work. You're not just going to fall over dead because you didn't want to go flip and eat burgers at Burger King because you were above that job. Right? What America needs is to let Americans struggle in their. We have too many safeguards, too many rails, too many social, programs that'll help you if you're down. No, if you fall down, every homeless person in America did not wake up one morning homeless. It wasn't a woman. It go down a non-productive road. Whatever road that was, whether it was drugs, whether it was alcohol, whether it was laziness, whether it was actually being a smart ass to your mom and your dad, that they kicked you out, your ignorance and your lack of personal responsibility led you to sleeping on a fucking sidewalk. All right.
Yeah.
It's America needs personal responsibility. It doesn't need more government.
Yeah. And also I think of it as the immune system, and that if you coddle the immune system when the child is young, that causes big problems in the long term, because it hasn't been able to really build itself up. And I kind of joking, I don't have kids of my own, but a lot of people that work for me do. And some of the people that are closest to me in my real estate business, my designer and her wife, or I'm sorry, my designer and her husband, Joaquin, who's the architect, they've got a couple small children, and the one kid is just a complete tyrant. And whenever, I mean, you take your eye off of him for 5 seconds, he's eating dirt and, you know, like breaking into glue and all of these things. And I always joke with them that the kid, when he gets old, he's never going to be sick a day in his life, because he's eating so many germs right now that he's going to have the strongest immune system ever created. And it's kind of a metaphor for what you're talking about. But, you know, one thing that's true, I think, you know, we're kind of in the same generation, Ben, and you see it in the smallest things. And I remember growing up, we were, of course, always into riding bicycles with your friends, you know, the BMX bikes and all these things. And we would just do crazy things. And we would build these jumps and try to slam into each other and just all this things, all these, just try to find ways to hurt ourselves, really. But I remember that, I mean, we didn't even know what a bicycle helmet was. And I always joke with people, and this is true, this is very true. The type of kids that I hung out with when I was 10, 11 years old, if you would have shown up to the local bike run or whatever wearing a helmet,
oh, you would have got beat up.
Much worse for your health than you know, the protection that you're getting from that helmet, because you got the shit beat out of you from all your buddies, right? So now I see it in all the parents. You know, they won't even let their kid ride like a razor scooter without a helmet. And now, and not only that, but back then, I mean, this is when I was 10, 11 years old. I mean, we would ride our bikes the entire day. We would go up to the mountain. I lived in Portland, in Oregon, in the suburbs. We would go way out to these farms where, I mean, miles and miles from our house when we were 10, 11 years old, with zero supervision. I mean, just, yeah, bye, Mom. I'm leaving. It's summer. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. I'll see you at 8 o'clock tonight. You know, bye. And now I go back to the United States, and my friends with kids, they're like, they can't even let them go to the park, like across the street by themselves, without someone calling the police and them getting in trouble for being neglecting their kids as a parent. I mean, I cannot believe the difference in my childhood growing up in the 1970s and 1980s compared to a kid, from what I've seen, growing up today. It's shocking how the difference, from a standpoint of how much, I guess, personal freedom to make mistakes and to hurt yourself and to get into trouble, how much freedom you had to do that when I was growing up, compared to how restrictive and how much freedom has been taken away from these kids growing up. It's like the psychologist, I forgot his name. He's like he does a lot of stuff with Jordan Peterson, but he calls it helicopter parenting, where these kids are growing up in this bubble of, yes, they never break their leg. Yes, they never poke their eye out. Yes, they never do this. That's very true. But also, when they get to be 20 years old, they're incompetent. I mean, they look to the government for that type of structure that they now cannot build for themselves, because they didn't have the opportunity when they were a kid to hurt themselves like
bingo. What you just said is the key. Is we have turned into a society that doesn't value pain. And let me explain what I mean when I say that. The reason it hurts when you cut yourself,
right,
is that action of pain. The reason the human body allowed and evolved or was created with the aspect of having nerves and feeling pain was to protect and educate the body, the
right,
mind
right,
of its environment. When you remove the value of pain, you remove a tool of education that is necessary for humans to grow and be able to exist in this environment on this planet that we live on. Pain is necessary to learning environments. If you walk into a dark room that you're not familiar with, you walk slow because of the fear of the pain of hitting your foot.
right.
That applies to everything in nature.
Yeah.
Everything in nature is actually built on the rewarding of effort. The rewarding of effort is the natural engine of nature.
Right.
That's the movement of nature, is the rewarding of a wise choice.
Yeah. But,
It's
let me
why,
interject one.
yeah,
Ben, let me, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm just going to forget this unless I say it right now. That's such an incredible point. If you extrapolate that to economics as well, and what we did with the bailouts in 2008 and 2009, where we didn't allow people to go bust. We didn't allow them to feel that pain on an economic level. So basically what we're doing with what we're talking about with coddling, young people, and we're now doing with corporations as well. So if you and I in our generation look at the younger generation, say, oh my gosh, they're a bunch of wusses because they didn't go through this pain, they didn't go through these struggles, it really toughens them up. Well, think about what we're doing to our entire economy by not letting businesses
making it weak.
feel pain.
Yes, yes, and let me extrapolate on your extrapolation. All right, is that links with our currency. A true currency must mimic nature.
Right.
It has to mimic nature, or it is not a true currency. It has to have a value added structure to the very base of the currency.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why they
Right
should be
now,
competitive.
right. Well, and this leads in with gold and cryptocurrency.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Our technology in the past, the lowest unit of energy or representation of value added scarcity was gold. That
Right.
was our lowest unit of scarcity that came from nature that we could actually base our currency on, according to the technology of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Cryptocurrency has now, because of the technology, has now changed that into a unit of electricity is is now going to replace gold, which gold is made up of units of energy. Everything is. Gold is made up of units of energy. Now we have the technology to actually base our global currency on units of energy using representation of a mineable cryptocurrency called Bitcoin. Bitcoin is created by units of energy put out into a processing system that is translated into a code that cannot be altered, that cannot be changed, that cannot ever be corrupted or rusted like gold. Gold doesn't rust. That's one of the factors that made it our base currency. It's why iron was never chosen as a base monetary unit, because rust kills the currency. Gold and Bitcoin does not rust because the code is incorruptible. The idea of rust is the weakening of the metal.
Mm-hmm.
That's what rusted. You could put an ounce of gold in the ground, million years come back, that ounce of gold is still sitting there. Coin is the same thing, except our technology has allowed us to move away from the old way of incorruptible energy representation, value added structure through labor of the mining of the gold and the mining of it. Well, Bitcoin is the next iteration in line with the technology that humans have achieved.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see gold and Bitcoin as just two not even apples and oranges. I see them as oranges and pickup trucks. I don't even. But your analogy, I totally get it, and it makes a lot of sense. And one thing
purely, hang on, it's purely generational. The generation that values gold is actually dying off.
Right, but I think that but I think the volatility in the price of Bitcoin is too much currently, right now. I'm not saying that it can't change, but right now it's just too volatile to be considered an insurance policy, which is how I look at gold.
Well, the reason you see gold as an insurance policy is not because you have the mathematic information that gives you the accurate price of gold. But how much gold is in the world?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how many ounces of gold are in the world. It's not
a
lot.
No. Not in existence, but in the world.
It's mineable. I mean, they've got tons of gold at the Earth's core that they can't get to. But
so if you do not have an accurate number to calculate the price, can you truly have a price?
No, but the price I don't think is relevant. And what I mean by that is it's about the purchasing power. And if you look at the 5,000-year history of gold,
that is the price.
Well, yeah, to a certain degree. But I mean, Yeah, maybe with gold, but other assets, the price really has nothing to do with the purchasing power, because you've got to factor in inflation. Like Venezuela, you could have a house that's nominated in bolivars that the price could go to the moon, but it could lose purchasing power. But my point is that with gold, it's maintained its purchasing power for so long that I've got quite a bit of confidence that in the next 20 or 50 years, that it'll probably buy about the same amount of goods and services that it did 100 years ago or 500 years ago, where Bitcoin, the price, or the purchasing power, let's just compare using the same scale, the purchasing power of Bitcoin fluctuates substantially. And I don't have a 5,000-year history, I have a 10-year history. And granted, that 10-year history, the purchasing power has increased exponentially, as we all know, even though it's gone through a bubble and crashed. And it's still, if you look at it from day one, it's there's no better speculation or no better investment. But and I understand that it's limited to 21 million Bitcoin, which is great, because to your point, you've got a quantifiable number there. Are you
Yeah,
there? I think I might have
yeah,
lost you. Okay.
yeah,
But you've got a quantifiable number there, and I totally understand that. It's just for me, and I'm not saying that if you prefer Bitcoin, you're right or wrong, or if you prefer gold or silver, you're right or wrong. I'm just saying, for me personally, when I look at them, I just compartmentalize them, and I don't really compare and contrast the two, just because for me, Bitcoin is a speculation currently.
yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that in 20
Right.
years or 30 years, we couldn't have an iteration of Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency that is far superior to gold from the standpoint of being insurance. And therefore, then I'd put them in the same bucket and compare them to one another.
You just agreed with me without knowing you agreed with me.
You're
Because
good. Look at how good you are. My goodness gracious.
I
Wow.
because that whole explanation led to the last couple of sentences where you said, me personally,
Yeah.
I value gold. What I said before was it's a generational thing.
Right. There you go.
It's the people that value gold is shrinking because the technology of purchasing has advanced. Where you value gold, take that gold to your grocery store and go shopping with it.
Right. Well, I'm not saying gold is a good currency. Or I'm not
Right,
saying that at
right,
all. I'm
right,
just saying it's a good store
but
of value.
right, but a good store of value at the same time must be locally also be able to use as a currency. Now, gold you can use as a currency amongst the gold dealers or the gold community of your local community. So
Mm-hmm.
if you need groceries, you could go to your local dealer and get US dollar, then go shopping with it.
Right.
Well,
Right.
right. With cryptocurrency Bitcoin, I have a card that
You do
links with
both.
my Bitcoin.
Oh, well,
All right.
time out. Well, yeah, time out, Ben. I want to blow you away here. Just one. Are you prepared for this? I don't know if you can handle this, but
All right.
see my phone?
Yeah.
You know what that is?
What is that?
That's the wallet of Satoshi right there, my friend.
Oh, you got, all
Are you proud
right.
of me, Ben? Are you proud of me? I can...
Welcome to the future.
Yeah, I
It's,
actually did an interview with a really awesome guy. He's great. His name's Alex Saunders, and he's a Bitcoin expert from Australia.
I've
And
heard of them.
yeah, he's really big online and social media. And I interviewed him, and he helped kind of educate me on Bitcoin. And he said, you know what? Let's do this. Why don't you put your phone? Why don't you download this app? So he said it's the wallet of Satoshi. So I'm like, okay. And we did this in real time, right during the interview. And I downloaded the app, and I'm like, okay. So now what? He's like, well, put it up to the webcam. So I kind of like, put it up like that, and like instantly I looked down and he's like, yeah, I just transferred you 10,000 Satoshis, which is about equivalent to $1. And we did that to the webcam. I'm looking at this and I'm like, wow. I'm like, okay, that's cool. That's really, really cool. And what's funny is it was an interview for my channel, but he recorded it as well. He took that little clip, that 30-second clip, and posted it up on Twitter, and it, you know, like went viral. It had just thousands and thousands of views because it's you know, someone just the light bulb kind of going on about Bitcoin, and it is yeah, it was definitely really, really neat. This you can see, especially as someone who travels as much as I do and has to wire money outside of the United States and inside,
right.
and how cumbersome that is. It's just
I hate to wrap this up, but I'm getting low on the battery on my phone.
yeah, no problem. No problem.
So, all right, guys. Hey, thank you so much, George. That was a great talk.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Amazing.
That was a lot of fun.
Everybody,
I think we should just tell those other guys to stay home next weekend, Ben. Just
yeah, we don't need
got it
them.
covered.
Hey, I'm actually going to have you on my channel soon because this was a great conversation. All right, everyone, have a great day. This is Bitcoin Ben driving home from Florida from a consultation for cryptocurrency. Check out my Patreon channel for more education on the wealth that's being generated in cryptos. And check out George. George, where can they get you?
Just George Gammon, Gammon on Twitter or YouTube. I've got tons and tons of videos there talking about this macro econ stuff.
Absolutely. Check me out on YouTube too. This is Bitcoin Ben and George signing off for the Wise Guys program or whatever we're calling it now. Everyone have a great day. I'll talk to you later.